Good day. I'm Daniela Ellerbeck, the Constitutional Rights Program Manager at the FW de Klerk Foundation. Welcome to this episode of the Constitution at Work podcast. Joining me today are colleagues Ismail Joosub, the Manager of the Constitutional Advancement Program, and the Foundation's Executive Director, Christo van der Rheede.
Thank you, Daniela, and thank you, Ismail, also for your presence.
What has made headlines is that yesterday, the 23rd of January 2025, President Cyril Ramaphosa assented to the Expropriation Bill. What do you think the political maneuvering was and the political thinking was?
There's a couple of considerations that actually forced his hand to this. Obviously, land reform comes into play. From a political perspective, remember, he was under severe pressure during the ANC 54th conference to deal with the issue of land reform. And there was also this motion by the EFF in 2017 and later on by the ANC that consideration should be given to expropriation without compensation. And then everything came to a head in 2021 when Parliament in effect rejected the changing of the Constitution. I think the President is using the signing of this bill into law as a means to take the political pressure off him. Because remember, there's a 55th conference that need to take place and he can easily lose his job, and one doesn't know what will happen should the leadership change within the ANC and the whole thing of changing the Constitution comes onto the table again. So I think it was a strategic move from his side.
Christo, you spoke about the potential burdens that this new piece of legislation could have on the economy. Could you perhaps elaborate on that?
Let me emphasize the following. There's a big need for housing, and I think it's important that the state should have the capacity and should be empowered, or a municipality, to expropriate land for housing purposes as well as for other purposes, the building of bridges, the building of roads and things like that. So state entities must have that capability. But the big challenge, obviously, whose land? And obviously, will due process be followed? Now, where I'm staying, there's huge tracts of land owned by Transnet, owned by various state-owned enterprises. This land should actually be made available for housing purposes. We've seen a massive drive in terms of urbanization to cities, and especially young people cannot afford housing because it has just become too expensive. There is a speculative nature that needs to be dealt with. I know in Australia and in the United Kingdom, government has clamped down on people who have used land for speculative purposes and has just pushed the prices up. At the end of the day, the ordinary population cannot afford a house. Our big challenge is, if this is solely aimed at state-owned enterprises, for example, Transnet, Eskom, who owns big pieces of land in the cities, then I think it's a necessary evil, so to speak. But when the act is used to expropriate land arbitrarily, from private individuals, then we're treading on dangerous grounds because it will create a lot of uncertainty. It will also create a situation where people will say, but it doesn't make economic sense to invest in land. And then you place the entire investment portfolio of financial institutions at risk, because currently we owe financial institutions in the region of 4 trillion rand. Because I go to a bank, I ask for a loan, I build my house, and then for the state to come and just expropriate, I think it will be disastrous for the country. The same applies to farmland. Remember, farmers, they produce food on the back of debt. And they use the land for collateral purposes. And I think that is what we really need to guard against, that we don't have a situation where this act is abused by political actors. It will obviously lead to economic fallout and impoverishment, but also disinvestment.
the Constitution says that if you expropriate property in the public interest or for a public purpose, then you need to give the person whose property you're expropriating just an equitable compensation. The fact that the Constitution was not amended to explicitly allow for expropriation without compensation, and now we have this Expropriation Act that says that you can expropriate land for no compensation and that no compensation is just inequitable. It seems like trying to achieve the same purpose as what was sought to be achieved unsuccessfully with amending the Constitution. What are your thoughts on this?
In the first place, the political agenda of the president and the governing party is very clear. They want to restore the faith of the electorate in them, and it was a very strategic and clever move, especially in the run-up of the local elections. The bigger challenge, obviously, is for the courts now to ensure that this act is properly implemented. Now, what is happening in practice? Thousands of people are migrating to cities throughout South Africa. We see it in Johannesburg, we see it in Pretoria, we see it in Cape Town, P and those places. And people just occupy land illegally. And the court has issued a lot of court orders to prevent it in the first place, or secondly, to move people out of that land. But the reality is people completely disregard those court orders. Unfortunately, especially the timing of this signing this bill into law, and I don't want to sound alarmist, will create a perception in people's minds that we can go about and just occupy land. You cannot have a situation where people just occupy land and completely disregard court orders. And that, for me, is a very, very big concern.
Daniela, I'm sure many of our listeners are in a great deal of confusion as to how this bill was actually signed. And I think perhaps it would be best if you can walk us through the legislative landscape insofar as the legal lay of the land is concerned.
Thank you, Ismail. That's a brilliant question, because I think that this can actually be quite confusing, because hang on, the president just signed into law something that allows no compensation, but I thought that the Constitution was explicitly not amended. What exactly happened? So we had the Constitution 18th Amendment Bill back in 2021, and this bill specifically aimed to amend Section 25 of the Constitution to say that an amount of no compensation is explicitly stated as a legitimate option for land reform. Now, what happened is that at the end of 2021, Parliament rejected this bill on the 7th of December. So the public might remember that this was a massive political debate at the time, and Parliament ended by saying, we will not change the Constitution to state that no compensation is a legitimate option for land reform. The Constitution is the supreme law of the country, but now what has happened is that this subordinate law, this Expropriation Act that allows for no compensation, has been signed into law by the president. But what this act says is that it's just inequitable for no compensation to be paid for land. So in effect, we see that legally the same outcome was sought, but because the supreme law couldn't be changed, a subordinate piece of legislation was passed. Now, this opens up a whole can of worms legally, because given that we have this whole process where the Constitution was specifically not amended to allow for no compensation, this Expropriation Act that has now been signed into law is immediately open to being challenged constitutionally in courts for not being constitutionally compliant. Now, there's a variety of ways that can happen, and something that the Foundation is asking the members of Parliament to consider is that Section 80 of the Constitution makes explicit provision for a situation like this, where a law has been signed into being that at least a third of the members of the National Assembly are concerned about its constitutionality, and it allows them 30 days from the date that the president signed the law to go to the Constitutional Court and ask for the Constitutional Court to declare that law inconsistent with the Constitution, so being illegal. So the Foundation is really calling on MPs to work together, to find each other. There has to be at least a third of MPs, at least, in the National Assembly that are really concerned about the constitutionality, never mind the economic consequences that Christo has so aptly outlined, and to make use of the Section 80 provision for them. They have this. It is by far the quickest route. They get direct access to the Concord.
Yeah, what is important is that we've seen a massive failure on the part of the state in terms of land reform, also housing, dealing with the housing issue in the country. The state failed in terms of executing its mandate, which is embedded in the Bill of Rights in terms of housing, access to housing, for example, and even in terms of access to food and water, etc. But let me state the following. This law is now and can be seen as a sort of, this will solve our issues, which in fact will not happen, because we've seen out of all the reports, there's a report in terms of the recapitalization program, that 80% of those farms are just lying idle. We've seen a report previously in terms of the communal property associations that 80% of those, even 90% of those CPAs are no longer using the land productively. There's no food production. It has become a poverty trap. Then, thirdly, we have read all about the land agency that the state has mandated to deal with the issue of land reform, the transfer of land, the collection of land rates, for, or the fees that people need to pay when they get this land. And we've seen a massive failure on their part. None of those productive farms are really providing food and is used productively. So this can easily be an easy route to satisfy the political outcome to the benefit of the president and the governing party, but is massively failing in terms of an economic outcome. And the economic outcome is simple. People who qualify, who are beneficiaries of land reform, they must have the ability to utilize this land to ensure food security for the country. And that's where the bigger challenge sits for us, because if those fundamental issues are not going to be addressed, for example, the utilization of that land for food security purposes, if they are not properly funded, because remember, agriculture requires a huge amount of money to buy inputs to make sure that the farm is operational. If there's no patient capital made available, then this will be a futile exercise. And we will see greater disinvestment. We will see people no longer really interested in investing in agriculture. And that will place the country at risk. And then also, on the other hand, when it comes to housing, we cannot allow a situation where people just occupy land illegally, put up shacks. It's to the detriment not only of those people, but for all other people who really want to, create a safe or get a property in a safe environment and who are prepared to invest their life savings into it and utilize it to create wealth for future generations. So I think we have a not only a constitutional problem, as Daniela has clearly outlined, but we also have an economic, a political, and a social dilemma.
Christo, my question to you is, you've mentioned how the president, having signed this bill into law, sees an opportune moment before the 2026 local government elections. I would like to hear your views on what this means for the continued cooperation of the Government of National Unity.
I think the partners in the Government of National Unity, they are all trapped between the devil and the deep blue sea. On the one hand, I think if they walk out now, that opens the door for the president's enemies to step into that void, and then you're going to have a complete different ballgame, which will not be in the greater interest of the country. Secondly, I think the role of the minister, I think it's Minister Dean McPherson, am I right, from the DA? He will have to play a very, very big role to ensure that this law, if the court says there's nothing wrong with the law, to make sure that this law is properly implemented, to ensure that there's no abuse and that there is just and fair compensation. So I would not advise the DA and the Freedom Front Plus to relieve themselves from the GNU. I think their role within the GNU will become even more critical.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for joining us, and we hope that this has been an insightful podcast for our viewers. Please follow and like and subscribe.